to Books in Hindsight, the only podcast where hindsight is always 2020. And we explore the great books, works, and ideas of the century. Now, here's your host, teacher, and author, Matthew Heines.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Books in Hindsight. I am your host, teacher, and author, Matthew Heines. I want to welcome everybody who is just tuning into the show for the first time. Welcome. And I want to welcome everybody who is returning to watch the show. The last two shows were really great. As I explained the first two times, the first 5 episodes of Books in Hindsight are going to be episodes where we talk about the works that I've done, but we also work to get rid of all those technical glitches in our show. And let me tell you, ladies and gentlemen, we have had a few, and I'm just going to take a minute or two to talk about those. But before we get into that, I want to tell everybody that today we're going to be talking about Saudi Arabia. We're going to be talking about what's going on there now, and we're also going to talk about my book, Killing Time in Saudi Arabia, which is about my experiences working in the kingdom from 2004 to 2005. All right, so let me just start to talk about how my week has gone. And what I've been trying to do all week is basically set up a podcast, this podcast. And I want to tell you that the microphone I have, this is an Audio-Technica 2020, something like that. And I have it attached to a UMC 202 made by Behringer, and also I have a Knox Gear pop guard here, and these were all amazingly on sale for just $109 on Amazon, and I'll leave the link in the description. So when I saw that, I said, all right, so now I'm going to get going and get my own podcast going, but not so fast. Because when I went to set up the podcast, it just seemed like nothing would work. And I'm just going to give you one example. I spent like an hour. I got the microphone out. I connected it. I connected it to the amplifier. I connected it to my computer, and I watched every tutorial. I must have watched like 5 or 6 just on the amplifier, and then I watched everything I could watch about the microphone, even before I bought it. And then after I bought it, okay, I watched the setup and everything because I wanted to have everything right. So I connected everything, and guess what? Nothing happened, and I got so angry, and I spent probably another hour. And remember, I'm trying to get going with this podcast, and I want to get it done today, right? So I spent like an hour. What is wrong with this thing? I guess I have to send it back. It doesn't work. And I looked at the tutorials. I looked at the instructions. And then on the back of the amplifier, guess what I found? An on-off switch. So that was just one thing that happened. And I'm not going to go into too much detail, but let me tell you, if you are setting up a podcast on Libsyn, I went and got my own Books in Hindsight domain, and that caused me so many problems because I don't build web pages, and I can do my own website, but it didn't work. So my podcast, I did everything they said on every tutorial I watched, and it still didn't work. So it was a very frustrating experience. And when you talk to Libsyn, they seem to think that everybody is a techno geek, and they're not going to help you very much at all. So I don't know if this will ever actually end up in a podcast. My only hope now, and the only thing I do know for sure, is that I will just post this on YouTube, and I know it will end up there. So that's been my week for so far, and I just want to tell you guys that it has been a very, very rough time, and I feel very frustrated. And of all the things that I've ever done, this is the most frustrating of all, because it's just one thing after another. So, and now we're dealing with all kinds of different equipment, and it can be very frustrating. But on the plus side, I do want to say I'm very happy with this Audio Technica mic and the way that the Behringer sounds. It's really fantastic. So I would recommend these to anybody who's going to start a podcast. And if you'll click on the link in the description, then that would get some money to Books in Heinessight as well, which we all wouldn't mind. All right. So let's talk a little bit about the upcoming shows we're going to have. We're going to have, this is episode 3. This is not episode 3, really. It's segment 3. So this is segment 3, and we're going to have 2 more. And in the next episode, we're going to talk about Oman, the Sultanate of Oman. And we're going to talk about my book, My Year in Oman. And then on the 5th episode, we're going to talk about my book, Deceptions of the Ages. And we are going to ask the question, if we didn't go to the moon, how did astronauts see aliens on the moon? All right, so that's what we got coming up. Now, let's talk about the topic of today, and that is the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Now, I'll give you guys just a little bit of a historical background just off the top of my head, and then we're going to talk about some of the modern things that are going on in Saudi Arabia. And I tell you, they are getting more and more bizarre. And having lived in Saudi Arabia, there is really nothing that surprises me or anybody who's lived in the Magic Kingdom. All right, so Saudi Arabia is the center, first of all, of the Islamic religion. And it is home to the Shia, or I'm sorry, not the Shia, the Sunni religion, the Sunni Muslims. And they are in conflict with the Shia Muslims over in Iran. Now, the Shia and the Sunnis are interspersed all throughout the Middle East, so they live in different communities, and we saw that a lot in Iraq when they would attack each other. So these are two communities, two branches of Islam that do not really get along with each other, and they are diametrically opposed to each other. And the history of Islam is also the history of Saudi Arabia, pretty much in the modern context. So the Islam began in the 600s when the Prophet Muhammad began to broker peace deals between traders that were traveling the frankincense route. And after Muhammad died, the Arabs took his message and they captured Egypt. They took over the Middle East, and basically they killed off what was left of the Eastern Byzantine Empire that was once the Roman Empire. So it was basically a sick empire to begin with, and the Muslims came and they offered people a deal. And they said, if you, in the old system, there was a tax of 25%. The Muslims said, you only have to pay 10. And everybody said, okay, that sounds like a better deal. So the caliphate, which is the kingdom or the king of Islam, is what all of Islam wants. And when you talk about the Islamic State in Syria and whatever, I studied Islamic political thought in college, and having lived in the Middle East for many, many years, I have to just tell you that's my expertise, because what the ISIS and the Islamic State, wherever, is that they don't believe in democracy. They want to have like the caliphate, and they think there should be one ruler, one imam that should rule over everybody. No democracy, no popular vote, just one guy to make the decisions for everybody. So this is what the Muslims want, and this is one of the backbones of Saudi Arabia, in that the Saudi Arabian king, and we've all heard stories, they have a deal with their Muslim, what they call the Matawas. Then this is the religious, almost a militant religious branch of what we would almost call priests, or somewhere between priests and religious police, which is actually more accurate as to what they do. So the Matawas said, you can have power as long as we can keep our power. And so this relationship is what has created the bizarre state of Saudi Arabia, both in the past and today. So I want to take a minute or two before I start talking about my book, and I want to talk to you guys a little bit and tell you some of the things that are going on in Saudi Arabia today. And as I said, having lived in Saudi Arabia, some of this stuff, or most of this stuff, does not surprise me. So the first thing that I want to talk about, and something that everybody's been concerned about, is is this human rights activist. Now, there's a young woman, and her name is Isra Al-Ghamgan, and it's actually pronounced Al-Ghamgan. I can't do the G in Arabic very well, but she is a Shia, and she is a human rights activist in Saudi Arabia. And as of today, there are rumors going around that she has been executed. So, why has she been executed? She's been executed because she is, number one, asking for women's rights, and number two, she is a Shia. Now, remember what I just said. Shias are in Iran, but Shias are also all along the coast of Saudi Arabia. They're in Qatar, they're in Bahrain, and there are very many of them in the Sultanate of Oman. And so the Shia, as I just mentioned, have a ages-long conflict with the Sunni. So having a Shia in Saudi Arabia is advocating human rights and criticizing the government is not something that the government is going to tolerate for any length of time. And I will tell you one story that I hope that this will help you to understand, and then I'll move on. The last contract I did in Saudi Arabia was I left Saudi in 2013. And I was working outside of Mecca. I was living in a town in the mountains called Taif. And my wife and I would go down. We worked for the Raytheon company, so we would go down on the weekends because there's nothing in Taif. It's very Saudi. And we would go down to Jeddah, which is a more modern city, and you can go and hang out on the beach, and Western rules apply. You can't drink there. You're not supposed to drink there, but there's no Saudis there, and so it's just all Westerners, so bathing suits and anything else you want, and diving in the Red Sea, and shopping at a real shopping mall, especially the Red Sea Mall. It's all a really great experience. And the point of this story is we would leave Jeddah on Friday morning because we'd have to work on Saturdays because the days are different there. And when we would leave, there would be thousands of kids on the main street of Jeddah. It's early in the morning. Everybody else is in bed. But there are thousands of kids. They've been up all night, and they're racing motorcycles and Lamborghinis and Porsches and you name it. They are racing them up and down the street, up and down the main street of Jeddah. And the police just are sitting there watching just in case somebody has an accident. No problem, right? And I always made the comment to my wife that if these kids ever get a hold of guns, there's going to be a problem. And just to reinforce this fact, and this is what the people in Saudi Arabia and all of these Muslim countries are very terrified of. Muslims keep having kid after kid after kid. So the majority of people in Saudi Arabia and all these Middle East countries are below the age of 30, and in most cases now below the age of 20. You have a mushrooming population. So it is very hard, and it's going to be even harder to keep a clamp down on things, because as the population grows, the money from the oil revenue, there's just not enough to go around. And we've already reached what I call a critical mass, where people in Saudi Arabia and the Middle Eastern countries, they don't want to work. They just want to sit in an office and drink coffee and read the paper until it's time to go home. And anybody who's been in these countries can, people who haven't would say, how can you say that? But anybody who's been in these countries know that that's true. And that's one of the problems they're having right now with expatriates leaving, is that the Saudis just really don't want to do any work, and especially manual labor. So the the next thing that I want to point out to you is that these there's just not enough to go around, and so eventually people start to get angry, and they say, well, how come that guy gets so much and I don't have any? And another piece of fuel for the fire is that in 2005, or actually 2010, I believe it was 2010, I'm sorry for not knowing, but there were 5,000 Saudi princes, right? And these princes all need to have their own house and their 4 wives and their Lamborghini and everything that the other princes have. So this is a major drain, because there's probably 25,000 or 35,000 Saudi princes now that want the same thing, and they're all trying to get at the same revenue source. So when you start to hear about people being arrested, about people trying to overthrow the government, and about the government clamping down, well, this is why. Because they are there's just too many people. It's just too dynamic now, and they have to clamp down, because if they don't, things could get out of hand very quickly. And we saw what happened in Egypt. And so these are just some of the things that I want to explain to you now. But it looks like Isra al-Ghamgan, the people are already saying, as of today is the 31st of August, that sometime last week she was executed, and we can only hope that that is not true. All right, the next thing I want to talk to you about is this story. This is in Express. The last one was in Fact Check. Saudi Arabia hatch bizarre plot to turn rivals Qatar into an island with a huge canal. So the Saudis are going to build a huge canal that will separate them from the Qatar Peninsula. So I'll just read you the beginning of the story. A senior Saudi official today appeared to confirm local media reports. The kingdom is considering digging a canal to separate the Qatari Peninsula from the mainland and turn it into an island, amid a year-long dispute between the neighbors. Okay, well, I guess they're just going to take their mainland and go home. Crazy. So the next thing I want to talk to you guys about is this is a bizarre story as well. It seems that it says APC in the story. This is from some place called Punch, and the English is not that great, so I imagine the English is not their first language. But the headline reads, 3 APC council chairmen die in Saudi Arabia's accident, and then it says something about a commission, which I don't know what the commission has to do anything, but I'd assume the APC is something about an African Petroleum Council. So the sentence is 3 African Petroleum Council chairmen die in Saudi Arabia's commission, whatever. So the Hajj Commission in Zamfara on Friday confirmed the death of 3 local government chairmen of the All Progressive Congress from the state in an auto crash in Saudi Arabia. Now, this really looks like it's been put into Google Translate and translated poorly. But the PRO, the Public Relations Officer, Malam Yaqub Yahya, Talata Mafara confirmed the death to the news agency of Nigeria in a telephone interview. Talata Mafara said the accident occurred around 3 a.m. on Friday while they were traveling from Mecca to Medina, Saudi Arabia. All right, well, they were probably going too fast, and sometimes people blow out a tire, and the only thing suspicious is they were part of the competing petroleum council that was competing with OPEC. So that's pretty interesting. All right, now the last piece of modern info I want to talk to you guys about is this this thing, because this kind of sums it up right there. This is from Politico magazine. And the article says, what is Trump getting for sucking up to Saudi Arabia? The byline is, in our 65 plus years of experience working on U.S. Middle East policy, we've never seen anything like the Trump administration's willingness to prostitute American interests to Saudi Arabia. So here's the story. Ever since Franklin Roosevelt's historic rendezvous in 1945 with Abdulaziz ibn Saud, the founder of Saudi Arabia, American presidents have been enamored with Saudi kings. But nothing in the 70-plus year history of U.S.-Saudi ties comes close to the cosmic groveling, this is Politico, not me, that now defines President Donald Trump's relationship with Saudi Arabia and his slavish obeisance to its dangerous and irresponsible policies. Since Trump has been president, this is what I wanted you to hear, the U.S. has enabled and supported a disastrous Saudi war in Yemen, watched as Riyadh launched a political and economic war against Qatar that split the Gulf Cooperation Council and enhanced Iran's influence, stood by as the Saudis virtually kidnapped the pro-American Lebanese prime minister in a bungled attempt to weaken Hezbollah, remained silent while the Saudis, under the guise of reform, cracked down on journalists, bloggers, businessmen, and anyone else who dared criticize the 30-something crown prince, and said nothing as Riyadh battered Canada, a close U.S. ally that dared challenge Saudi human rights abuses. All right, well, I talked a little bit about the history of Saudi Arabia, and now I'm going to put the closer on that history, and we'll start talking about my book, Killing Time in Saudi Arabia. In 1953, there was a democratically elected leader in Iran, and his name was Mohammad Mossadegh. And the CIA wanted the oil from Iran, and they did not want a democratically elected leader in Iran, especially one that might decide to threaten the state of Israel. So the U.S. overthrew Mossadegh and installed the Shah. Now, this was a warning sign to all of the leaders of the Middle East. And it was like the stick that was never really used until 1973. And in 1973, the Arabs and the Israelis went to war, and the Arabs said, if the West is going to support the Israelis, then we are going to stop exporting oil. And so there was a major oil shortage throughout the world. There were long gas lines, and people were very upset about the interruption of the flow of petroleum. So the Americans and their allies told the Saudis that, and in no uncertain terms, and this is according to the book Confessions of an Economic Hitman, and I'll leave a link in the description below. You can pick that up on Amazon as well. It's a really interesting book. But according to Confessions of an Economic Hitman, they read the Riot Act to the Saudi king and said, if you ever pull anything like that again, you're going to go the same way as Mohammad Mossadegh, and we will find somebody else. And if they do it, we'll find somebody else, and so on and so on. And so that has been the relationship of the United States and the Western world to Saudi Arabia. All right. So it's probably a lot to digest, and there are a lot of other things, happening in Saudi Arabia right now, especially concerning Iran. But right now I want to just stop, and I want to change gears for a little bit. I'm going to take a drink of water, and I want to start talking about my book, Killing Time in Saudi Arabia. Now, I just am going to give you a little bit of background on the book and what I was doing there, and I'll read a little passage from it in a little bit. But basically, here's the story. I was working in the Sultanate of Oman, and I had been working there for 2 years, and I loved it. And I had many friends, and it was just a super place to live, and the people there are great, and I just couldn't wait or I wanted to stay there. But I worked for a school that was run by some people, and they were interested in saving as much money as possible. So knowing that I wanted to stay, they said, well, you can stay, but you'll have to work for less money. And the reason they said that is because in that country and many countries in the Middle East, you can't just hop from job to job. You have to actually leave the country for 2 years and then come back. So I wanted to work in Oman. I really loved it there. And I had some very close connections, which you can read about in another year in Oman. But anyway, they wouldn't let me work for the same or more money, so I had to go out. So I called a company, and they seemed very eager for me to come over to Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. And I didn't know much about the company, but as we'll see in the book, I found out when I got there, this company needed teachers because they had been attacked in 2004 by Arab terrorists. Now, some of the things that you're going to see in the book, I'll just tell you now that because I want to get you kind of interested in it, is that the compound that was attacked by the Saudi terrorists after the Abu Ghraib prison thing came out, right? This is in May of 2004. So after the Abu Ghraib thing came out, well, all Saudi Arabia just went haywire, and they started killing people, and there were some brutal murders. The mayor of Riyadh, his son was murdered, and his bride at their wedding, and one of my friends was actually there when the terrorists came in. So anyway, the Saudis attacked this compound, and the compound was built by none other than the Bin Laden family. So the attackers that came in knew exactly how to work the gate, and in the compound itself there were a number of buildings, there were Filipinos working there, there were Pakistanis, there were all kinds of different nationalities. But the Saudi terrorists somehow knew exactly which building the Americans were living in. They parked a truck full of dynamite outside the building and detonated it. And when I arrived at this company in Riyadh, well, that was one of the first things I saw. And so talk about a wake-up call. So my time in Saudi Arabia was really just a time of, at least in the beginning, I really thought I'm not going to survive this. The company I worked for, they didn't really seem to have a lot of priorities for security for English teachers, which is what I was. If you were a mechanic for an armored personnel carrier, then you were a high value commodity. But an English teacher in an army unit is like basically a ant at a picnic. And we were not very welcome. And as you'll see in the book, there were various reasons for that. But for me, my time there was, first of all, trying to figure out a way to survive the experience. And then once I did that, the next thing for me to do was to enjoy and try to make it through the experience in as good as style as I could. And also because from the very beginning, as I had done in Oman, I looked around and I said, boy, people have to know about this. People have to experience this. People have to know what this is really like, because it was just so amazing. And I'm just going to say that now. The biggest motivation for writing any of my books about the Middle East is because they are books that are going to portray the Middle East in a way that you will never see portrayed because of the arms industry. But it is a wonderful place it's a wonderful place to live, and the Arabs are very wonderful people. And of course, it didn't hurt that I was a white American there, and a male at that. So basically, I got to have free run of the country because I worked for the Saudi National Guard. All right, so I'm going to just take a second here, and I'm just going to show you the cover of my book because this kind of highlights some of the stories in the book. These are some of my students. These are captains and lieutenants in the Saudi National Guard. And I go into a lot of detail of explaining what the Saudi National Guard is. I don't want to get away from all that glare from that light. All right, so there's a story in here about the camel farm that you will love. And then we went to where they have falcon farm. We went to a lieutenant's falcon farm. And this is how I blended in. I don't know if you can see that white Jeep there, but that is actually a Land Cruiser the Saudis call the Capsula. And they also call it the Monica Lewinsky. Why? Because it has a big back, they say. So interesting information. And so here is the building. This is the first building. You probably can't see that well. You have to look on Amazon or buy this book. But this building is the one that the Saudis targeted when they attacked the compound in Riyadh. Okay, so I'm going to read you just a few sentences. Let's see. This is when I met one of my first friends, fellow teacher. And I have to tell you guys that in this book, I can't use people's real names because they are in the intelligence community. They're working in Riyadh, or they're working for different defense contracts, and so I can't expose them by using their name. So I'm just going to read about a guy who tries to explain to me. Now, I'm also ex-military, so I know a lot of this stuff, but I was not coming as an ex-military person like everybody on the contract. I was coming as a college-educated teacher, which scared people. All right, so, nah, I'm an English teacher, I said. Oh, you must be Heines, the new school teacher. The new school teacher, I asked. Millie's school teachers? Is this Little House on the Prairie? Oh, don't worry. That's what they call us. He rubbed his hands together as if he were trying to keep them from freezing. It didn't seem that cold. Most of the Millies are ex-military, he explained. On the other hand, you have the teachers, who are college graduates with master's degrees. One guy, Zamboni, fake name, has a PhD. Since a lot of these Millies had a hard time with high school, they call us school teachers. You're a teacher too, I asked. From the way he spoke and looked, it was more than obvious he was an English teacher. I didn't want to make him feel bad, though, so I acted surprised. Yeah, he said, still rubbing his hands. Suddenly he stopped. He stuck them in the pocket of his field jacket he was wearing and looked at me again in my fatigues with the sleeves rolled above my forearms in the military style. Aren't you cold? Nah, not really. I'm from Washington State, I said. It was snowing when I left. Why, where are you from? Chicago, well, originally from Canada, but my father's an American now. I thought he was French-Canadian. I didn't want to ask. And this is cold to you? Yeah, real cold, he said, and blew into his hands. Larry Dijon from Chicago, or somewhere in the vicinity of Quebec, Canada, continued to act as if he were freezing to death. It was the first thing that I found strange about him. Although we would become friends over the course of the next months, it would by no means be the last. He looked up the street and, as he did, I turned and saw two vehicles approach. One was the silver Crown Victoria that had brought me to ex-con Village, and the other a white GMC Jimmy. The Jimmy pulled up first, and a guy who looked a lot like ex-football great Jim Brown rolled down the window. "Good morning. Is your name Heines?" he said, smiling at me. "Yeah," I said. "Welcome to the English language training section. I'm Rufus White." So that is your peek into killing time in Saudi Arabia. If that seems interesting, you can get another peek if you go to Amazon and go to look inside the book. This book is available at Amazon for I believe it's $19.99. Heinessight about $19.99 to $25. It's been so long since I've looked at the price of these books, but usually they're about $19.99 wherever you go in the print version, and about $5.99 to $10.99 in the digital version. So you can get Killing Time in Saudi Arabia and all my books at Heinessight.com, which is my personal website, or you can go to Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Barnes & Noble's Nook, KOBO, and, of course, iTunes. So, Saudi Arabia. What are my final thoughts about it? Well, this is what I think. I really loved living in Saudi Arabia. I really love the Saudi people. And I feel that they are just kind of doomed. They're just living in a very bad neighborhood, and they have an outlook on life that is centuries old, and they just don't seem to want to change. And to give them the benefit of the doubt, I am telling you, you live in America, and this is going to be hard for people to understand, but you live in America and you're just like everybody else. But a guy like me goes to Saudi Arabia, and I live like a king. Everybody's worried about if I'm going to be safe. There's beautiful women of all nationalities there. In fact, I met my beautiful wife when I was in the Middle East. So you have just access to so much, and the culture and the ability to travel. And if you like camping or diving, it is just a, no pun intended, mecca of these things. I did so much wonderful diving in Saudi Arabia in the Red Sea. So I cannot possibly say enough about the country of Saudi Arabia. I enjoyed my time there. And the last reason I want to tell you that I wrote my book is because I was so fascinated by how much those people seem to care about me. I mean, there were a lot of Americans I worked with. In Oman, I was the only American, so that was kind of, like always the only American. So they just like me because I'm different. But in Saudi, I worked with a lot of Americans, but the Saudis really loved me. Why? Because I did what they did. I lived their life. I wasn't a Muslim, and although they tried and tried again, but I lived so much like they did. I drove the car that their grandparents drove. I camped out all the time in the desert, and even they didn't like to camp in the desert. But I was out in the desert every weekend, and I traveled to more places in Saudi Arabia than any of the people I taught. And so the fact that I just loved their country, and I told them that, yes, I want to ultimately write a book about this place because it just seems so incredible. So in the end, and in closing, in summary about my experience in Saudi Arabia, besides Lawrence himself, I don't think that there has been an American who has had access and has traveled as freely as I was able to do with my South African girlfriend, which was totally forbidden, but I was allowed to do whatever I wanted. And so that is why Killing Time in Saudi Arabia is so valuable as a story and as a historical document, because nobody, not even the Saudis, and they told me this many times, nobody would do the things that I did in Saudi Arabia because they said it was just too dangerous. But I have God smiling over me, protecting me, so I'm still here. All right, well, I'm not going to be here for much longer. I'm going to end the podcast now. I want to remind you guys that the next podcast we're going to talk about my book, The Year in Oman. And if you'd like to, look up the Sultanate of Oman, maybe check it out on Wikipedia. If you think Saudi is amazing, just wait until you hear about the Sultanate of Oman. All right, well, I'm Matthew Heines for Books in Hindsight. I hope you've enjoyed the podcast, and I hope you guys will tune in for the next one. We'll see you next time.
This has been Books in Hindsight with your host, Matthew Heines. Please join us for our next podcast and look for our archives on iTunes and go to thehindsight.com. That's HEINES site.com for great books by Matthew Heines and other great authors.